Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ed Steinfeld. I'm the director of the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs here at Brown University, and it is my pleasure today, truly, to introduce Ambassador Chas Freeman to deliver the Lee Gregorian Distinguished Lecture. Before briefly going over Ambassador Freeman's career, I just wanted to say a word about the Lee Gregorian Lecture. The lecture is named after and honors Chung-Wook Lee, who's the founder of the University of Suwon in the Republic of Korea, and of course also named after Vartan Gregorian, our president emeritus here at Brown. And Dr. Gregorian, as you know, is now president of the Carnegie Corporation of New York. The lecture was intended and is intended to celebrate the friendship between these two individuals, but it's also, and maybe even more important, intended to provide an opportunity for all of us in the community to have discussions and to develop an understanding of global issues and problems, but especially those affecting Asia and the United States. Well, obviously, there is nobody better suited to discuss issues of global concern, and particularly issues of concern surrounding Asia and the United States, than Ambassador Chas Freeman. I would eat into way too much of Ambassador Freeman's time if I gave you a full account of his truly extraordinary and incredible career, but I thought I would just mention some highlights for the few of you in the room who don't know or are not familiar with Ambassador Freeman. As a young Foreign Service officer, in 1972, Ambassador Freeman was the principal interpreter for President Nixon on the opening to China, on the trip in February 1972 to China. Ambassador Freeman was present at the creation, so to speak, for many of us who study contemporary China. But, as you'll see in a moment, he also was a deep participant in many of the events that transpired after 1972. Later, after the initial opening to China, Chas Freeman served as the Director of Chinese Affairs at the U.S. Department of State during the Carter administration, and he also served as Deputy Chief of Mission and Chargé d'Affaires at the U.S. embassies in Beijing and Bangkok. Chas, am I right that you opened the Beijing embassy after normalization, more or less?
Liaison office in '73.
Perfect, thanks. Also, in the Reagan administration, Ambassador Freeman was Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs during a particularly interesting time during the U.S. negotiation of Namibian independence from South Africa, and also the U.S. negotiations surrounding Cuban troop withdrawal from Angola. During the administration of President George H.W. Bush, Ambassador Freeman served as ambassador to Saudi Arabia, again during a very interesting and important time, the time of the first Gulf War, Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm. Then during the Clinton administration, Ambassador Freeman was Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, yet again during a very interesting time, a time at which the new security system, the new post-Soviet security system, was being designed for Western Europe. But Ambassador Freeman played a critical role in that design process and received distinguished awards for it. He also served in the Defense Department at the time when defense and military ties with China were being reestablished. There are many, many other highlights of Ambassador Freeman's career, but as I said, we can't go through them all. Let me just say that it's very obvious, it should be very obvious to you, that throughout his career in public service, Ambassador Freeman served loyally a variety of administrations, some Democratic, some Republican. Since retiring from the Foreign Service and entering many other interesting areas of business and public service, Ambassador Freeman has also been an equal opportunity observer and critic of administrations, Democratic and Republican alike. Ambassador Freeman is an extraordinary teacher, an extraordinary observer, and he's not somebody who pulls punches. So let me just finish by saying it would be somewhat ridiculous of me to say that Ambassador Freeman, serving now as a senior fellow at the Watson Institute, where he is, that would be the pinnacle of Ambassador Freeman's career. I wish that were the case, but alas not. I will say that his presence at the Watson Institute does represent a pinnacle moment for many of us at Watson, and certainly for myself. So with that, Chaz, let me turn it to you, and you will speak on the topic of the crumbling of Pax Americana. And the last thing is, this is a three-part series. So after you enjoy this one, on subsequent Thursdays, we will have parts 2 and 3. Thanks.
I was trying to avoid letting everybody know that I couldn't keep a job. And it's a great pleasure and privilege to be here, and even more to be associated with Ed and the Watson Institute. I am going to give 3 lectures. Today's is on some of the reasons we're in trouble and some of the reasons it may not be quite as easy to bounce back as is commonly assumed. Next Thursday, I'll talk about the way in which the world order has changed and whether we have or have not adapted to that series of changes. And I'll wind up by making a case for a completely different approach to diplomacy for the United States on the 3rd Thursday. But today I want to talk about the Pax Americana. In 1941, as the United States sat out the wars then raging in Asia and Europe, Henry Luce penned a famous attack on isolationism in Life magazine, which of course he founded and owned. "We Americans are unhappy," he began. "We're not happy about America. We're not happy about ourselves in relation to America. We're nervous or gloomy or apathetic." Luce argued that the destiny of the United States demanded that what he called the most powerful and vital nation in the world step up to the international stage and assume the position of global leader. The 21st century must be, to a significant degree, an American century, he declared. And so it proved to be, as America led the world to victory over fascism, created a new world order mimicking the rule of law and parliamentary institutions internationally, altered the human condition with a dazzling array of new technologies, fostered global opening and reform, contained and outlasted communism, and saw the apparent triumph of democratic ideals over their alternatives. But the 20th century, that 20th century, came to an end in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War and the emergence of the United States as a great power without peer. As the Soviet Union collapsed, we Americans celebrated our unrivaled military power and unilaterally proclaimed ourselves the indispensable nation. We didn't consult foreigners about that, by the way. But we failed to define a coherent vision of a post-Cold War order or an inspiring role for the United States within it. These essential tasks were deferred to the 21st century, which finally began in late 2001 with the shock and awe of 9/11. In the panic and rage of that moment, we finally made choices about our world role. These choices were intended to affirm our power, but they have instead defined a new era in which, our complacently exceptionalist self-image notwithstanding, the United States is ironically ever less geopolitically dominant, less internationally competitive, less emblematic of equality of opportunity, less faithful to the core values of our republic, and less looked up to for leadership by others. Today, Americans no longer call the shots in the Middle East, where Arabs, Israelis, and Turks now refuse to take direction from us. Iranians remain estranged, and Russians are again active adversaries. When we attempt to block China from creating new international financial institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, our allies, partners, and client states ignore us and join up with the Chinese. Our global standing has been diminished, not just by the rise of others and the estrangement of allies, but by structural changes in our economy, and ongoing disinvestment in education and research. We're becoming less competitive. Social mobility in America now compares unfavorably with that in other industrialized democracies. And we've acquired a permanent, and apparently permanent, mostly African-American urban proletariat, counting those who have dropped out of the labor force, as well as those who are still looking for work and therefore officially unemployed. Almost 103 million Americans of working age are currently without a job. Meanwhile, we're defending our freedoms by curtailing them. We ignore the separation of powers that is the foundation of our constitutional order. We have suspended much of our Bill of Rights. We are so accustomed to a perpetual state of war that our Congress no longer bothers to exercise its constitutional authority to authorize military interventions abroad, but leaves these to presidential discretion. We've unraveled much of the fabric of international law that we wove with such effort in the last century. Our panicky reactions to the activities of terrorists abroad are increasing the risk of terrorism at home, both homegrown and imported. The military power of the United States is universally acknowledged, but our moral authority, our reputation for considering the interests and listening to the counsel of allies, partners, and friends, and our luster as a just society with aspirations to continuing self-improvement have all taken hits. Post-constitutional America is adrift. No one knows what we stand for these days. Americans are understandably unhappy about this. Many are in denial. Few are at ease with the state of our country. As the tawdriness of our current political contests evidences, we are angry or gloomy or simply confused. We blame everybody but ourselves for our disquiet. It's in this context that I want to speak with you about the weakening of American power and influence in the world, its causes, its consequences, and what must be done to cure it. What accounts for our inability to end our wars or achieve the foreign policy goals we set? Why is it that when we run up the flag these days, ever fewer allies, partners, and friends salute? How is it that our statecraft has so obviously atrophied? I will be as brief as possible. I will therefore be superficial, but that's never bothered me in the least. Years ago, I was told by a wise man from the East that if something's worth doing, it's worth doing superficially. He was, of course, from the East Coast of the United States. Power is the capacity to make others do what they otherwise would not. Diplomatic power employs measures short of war to persuade others that it's in their interest to do things our way, rather than the way they originally preferred. But diplomacy demands a measure of guile, and it takes time. Americans have come to prefer the shock and awe of war and the instant, if ephemeral, gratifications of bombing and strafing to the protracted, often boring nonviolence of diplomatic discourse. Perhaps this is because our military power is so much greater than that of any other nation or coalition of nations that we're always confident we will prevail on the battlefield. Perhaps it's because, until recently, no foreign society the United States has attacked has retaliated against us in our homeland, making attacks on foreign countries and peoples seem risk-free. Perhaps it's a consequence of the U.S. preference for governance by elected and appointed officials uncontaminated by experience in statecraft and diplomacy or knowledge of geography, history, and foreign affairs. Our politicians tell us that our problems reflect a failure of the will. But no one abroad doubts the will or ability of the United States Armed Forces to overwhelm any enemy foolish enough to mount a direct military challenge to America. No one outside our country considers the United States insufficiently combative. On the contrary, foreigners have come to expect Americans to bluster belligerently and to bully, bomb, and zap recalcitrant enemies. Daesh, the so-called Islamic State or Caliphate, is skillfully exploiting American bellicosity to incite normal Muslims to join it in counterattacking what it portrays as a deepening American-led crusade that features the wanton killing of anyone professing Islam. American obduracy on the battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan and our willingness to reinforce failure with troop surges have removed past doubts among allies about U.S. resolve and staying power. But they've also won the United States a reputation for a fatal attraction to mission creep and for not knowing when to cut our losses and leave. Many abroad, including our closest allies, have come to doubt America's capacity to shape events intelligently through both war and measures short of it. After all, the last time the United States won a war and produced a better peace was in 1945. That was 71 years ago. In the 1950s, we held on but did not prevail in Korea. In the 1960s and 70s, we were humiliated in Vietnam. In 1991, we aced the military contest to liberate Kuwait, but flunked the diplomatic test of translating victory into regional peace and stability. We've just lost round 2 in Iraq. We're clearly headed for defeat in whatever round we are currently struggling through in Afghanistan. Far from proving our military omnipotence, these interventions have underscored its limitations. The U.S. armed forces are indeed the world's mightiest, but while our military power can remove regimes, we have demonstrated that it cannot replace them, or subdue populist nationalism, or prevent determined enemies from retaliating against our homeland, or the homelands of our allies. Our expanding struggle with extremists in the Muslim world is now showing that if unguided and unaccompanied by diplomacy, violent coercion is more likely to aggravate and enlarge conflict than to circumscribe it. Our ability to enlist or bend others to the causes we espouse has clearly weakened. Our options for dealing with the challenges we face are now more limited than they ought to be. None of this should be a surprise. There are lots of reasons for it. To begin with, America now suffers from what might best be called fiscal anorexia. People with anorexia imagine they are overly robust. To reduce their fancied bulk, they reduce their intake of nourishment. This emaciates and weakens them. Anorexia is a narcissistic syndrome that reduces the ability of those who suffer from it to cope with ordinary life, let alone more demanding challenges. Like anorexics, Americans have a neurotically distorted image of ourselves. I assume you all know the difference between a neurotic and a psychotic. A psychotic thinks that 2 + 2 is 5 and is prepared to kill you to prove the point. A neurotic thinks that 2 + 2, he knows that 2 + 2 is 4, but is very unhappy about it. Americans imagine that we are overgoverned and overtaxed. We've decided to cure our imagined bloat by cutting non-military spending, starving our government down to size. But the ratio of civilian government employees to population has fallen from 1 for every 80 citizens under Ronald Reagan to 1 for every 117 citizens under Barack Obama. Public service is very modestly compensated in the United States. Salaries for the most senior officials are a mere fraction of what private sector executives with comparable or allegedly comparable responsibilities are paid. And 29 of 34 OECD member countries have higher tax burdens than the United States. The average tax rate in the world's advanced capitalist economies is 36%. In the United States, federal, state, and local taxes take 27%. In the OECD, only the Turks, Mexicans, and Chileans have lower taxes than Americans. Most Americans are nonetheless convinced that the civilian side of government in the United States is too big. Americans are against big government unless it's in uniform. Non-Americans marvel at this perception and our willingness to tolerate the deterioration of government services that shriveled financing produces, even as we borrow money to bulk up our military. We treat the defense budget as a jobs program or an end in itself. It has never been audited, not once. The only fiscal policy the United States now has is military Keynesianism. This skewed approach to resource allocation is the reason that American physical and human infrastructure is no longer internationally competitive. It's also why American foreign policy is so militarily muscular and diplomatically puny. We spend more on our armed forces than the next 8 or 10 great powers combined. And it's said that there are more men and women in U.S. military bands than in our entire diplomatic service. And the bands have undergone extensive training to do what they do with superb skill, but the diplomats have not. America's diplomacy is under-resourced and under-skilled. It's led by amateurs, many of whom have bought their way into government. They are unfamiliar with government operations. They have no experience in conducting the nation's business abroad and no interest in building its long-term competence at diplomacy. They're at least as focused on the prospects for profitable exit from their government jobs through the revolving door as they are on actually doing those jobs. Our political appointees to ambassadorships and senior foreign policy positions are in the main hopelessly outclassed by their experienced professional foreign counterparts. Our career diplomats are nowhere near as well trained as their military or foreign diplomatic colleagues. Other than intelligence agencies like the CIA, no civilian department has anything like the massive funding, patronage power, or ability to dispense largesse that our Defense Department does. The views of our foreign policy elite are shaped by think tanks and academic institutions funded and staffed from the defense and intelligence communities, not diplomatic professionals. This necessarily skews Washington's policies toward military and other coercive means of influencing foreign nations. It also results in the U.S. Armed Forces being asked to do things that other countries expect their diplomats or development experts to do. These tasks are not part of the military skill set. Our armed forces have the money, but not the training to do them. So they rely on a huge, mostly ex-military, cost-plus contract force of dubious competence to address these problems. This quite predictably results in prodigious waste, fraud, and mismanagement, quite aside from the tens of billions of dollars that have gone missing in Afghanistan and Iraq. The peace-building tasks that are central to consolidating the results of the wars we have fought do not get done. The demonstrated incompetence of our government in foreign affairs has become a serious national and international problem, given the rise of other great powers and our country's narrowing margin for error. Those who can't live by their wits or their brawn, those who can't live by their wallets or their brawn must live by their wits. Americans could clearly afford less threadbare, more professional and competent institutions to make and implement both domestic and foreign policy. We've decided we won't pay the taxes needed to field such government. That means we need to think our way out of danger. But fiscal anorexia and brain-dead politics preclude this. This effectively leaves us to live by military brawn alone, and that is proving not just inadequate, but greatly counterproductive. Militarism is the glorification of the armed forces as the embodiment of the nation's virtues, assignment of priority to military interests over those of others, and a habitual inclination to use force, rather than measures short of war, to address foreign challenges to national interests. Joined to the uniquely American impulse to redeem the world by democratizing it, this translates into armed evangelism. Civic culture in America speaks of democratic peace, but celebrates the cult of the warrior at all significant public events. Militarism with American characteristics seeks maximum funding for the armed forces and military-industrial projects regardless of other demands on the federal budget, and even when there's no tax revenue to pay for them. It sponsors aggressive intervention to overthrow other people's governments and reorder the world to the liking of homegrown ideologues and academic theorists. It sets U.S. military dominance of other regions and the global commons as the supreme objective of American foreign policy. Our use of this approach to foreign affairs in the post-Cold War era has caused the United States to have worse relations with each of our great power rivals than any of them has with any other. Our allies are against us, are not against us, but they're not always with us anymore. Militarism has become a potent threat, not just to America's aspirations to global leadership, but to our national security, well-being, and domestic tranquility. In this century, applied to West Asia and North Africa, militaristic, that is to say, diplomacy-free foreign policy, has already added more than $2 trillion to the U.S. national debt, and unfunded liabilities from these misadventures promise to add another $4 trillion in the decades to come. The United States has lost 2 major wars while sacrificing the lives of almost 7,000 of our military professionals and permanently maiming at least another 50,000. Almost 1 million have claimed war-related disabilities already. U.S. interventions and other coercive measures like sanctions, drone warfare, support of Israel's and now Saudi Arabia's brutal efforts to terrify their neighbors, and the knock-on effects of these actions, including the sectarian warfare that they have ignited, have meanwhile killed as many as 2 million Muslims in other lands. One does not need an elaborate review of the history of European Christian and Jewish colonialism in the Middle East, or American collusion with both, to understand the sources of Arab rage or the zeal of many Muslims for revenge. In the United States, in the Middle East, the United States is now locked in a death-filled dance with fanatic enemies, ungrateful client states, alienated allies, and resurgent adversaries. Terrorists are over here because we are over there. In Europe, too, the American attempt to build a post-Cold War order purely on NATO's military foundations, as Ed indicated, I had something to do with that. That effort has backfired on hopes for stability and peace. The failure to contrive political economic processes to end historic antagonisms between Europe, Russia, and Turkey has made it all too easy for Russia to revert to type and Turkey to drift away from the West. Instead of seeking to build a new concert of Europe, the United States thoughtlessly encouraged the continuing treatment of Russia as a defense problem and abetted the rebuff of Muslim Turkey by European Christendom. Moscow first imagined the worst. It then acted in ways that fulfilled its paranoia by provoking the United States and others. For its part, Turkey abandoned its centuries-old effort to adopt a European identity and sought renewed association with the Muslim societies of West Asia and North Africa, downgrading its previous role as NATO gatekeeper for the Middle East. It did so just in time for U.S. invasions and drone attacks in the region to catalyze state collapse and sectarian warfare from Afghanistan to Syria and the Sahel. Invigorated by the spread of civil strife, Islamist terrorism with global reach has incorporated itself as a so-called caliphate spanning Iraq and Syria, with a proliferation of outposts in other states subjected to U.S. or NATO intervention. Europe now faces destabilization by an avalanche of refugees fleeing the wars and anarchy that U.S. invasions and covert actions helped ignite. The alienated European-born Muslim extremists who perpetrated the November 13 attack in Paris justified it as reprisal for French and other Western intervention against their co-religionists in the Middle East. As they hoped it would, their terrorism unnerved the West and provoked a panicked, paranoid response. The caliphate and its fellow travelers have today's Americans and Europeans pegged. We prefer dramatic, media-fostered narratives to uninspiring facts. That means we can be played. Since 9/11, over 400,000 Americans, almost 27,000 per year, or 73 per day, have died by gunfire in the United States. From 9/11 to date, a total of 45, or about 3 per year, have been killed by jihadis. The December 2nd mass shooting in San Bernardino, the 353rd officially tabulated domestic U.S. gun massacre since 9/11, was the first in 2015 to involve a Muslim immigrant couple rather than the normal disgruntled white male perpetrator acting on his own. And yet San Bernardino did not lead to demands to control sales of weapons to psychopaths, criminals, or gun nuts. Instead, it galvanized Islamophobic demagoguery focused on shutting down Muslim immigration. It also led, quite predictably, to rising pressure for escalated military intervention in the Levant. That's precisely what the extremist caliphate wants. Its success in evoking this response from Americans has global implications. Calls for a military pivot to Europe or boots on the ground in the Middle East imply a detour from yet another primarily military approach to shifting global strategic circumstances, the so-called rebalance to Asia. This is intended to preclude the loss of post-World War II naval hegemony in the Western Pacific. But even if the resources were there to do this, which they aren't, China's return to wealth and power is an ineluctable reality that must somehow be accommodated by its neighbors, as well as balanced by them and the United States. The emergence of the Indo-Pacific as the global center of economic gravity clearly justifies greater policy attention to the region, no doubt. But economic challenges require primarily economic, not military or even political responses. China's centrality in the region's economy and its global economic weight cannot be neutralized by additional military deployments or by the belated export of U.S. legal and financial norms envisaged by TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Military challenges to China's role invariably evoke Chinese military responses. They do not halt China's accretion of power. They simply focus the Chinese state on building military capabilities that can counter the threats it perceives from the United States. This stimulates China to flank these threats by using its growing economic power to gain leverage in places previously dominated by the United States. America's global and regional interests demand cooperation with other countries including China, to address common challenges ranging from climate change to nuclear and non-proliferation to international respect for the rule of law. Military rivalry does not foster attitudes conducive to cooperation. But even if the United States can gain China's support for our objectives, we cannot retain a leading position in either the Indo-Pacific or on the global stage without addressing obvious flaws in our country's current socioeconomic system. The problems we've developed are complex. They include our contracting domestic labor market, the widening gap between our rich and poor, and the deterioration of social mobility in our society. We need a peaceful international environment for domestic reconstruction. It will demand introspection and processes of domestic reform that are even more politically difficult than those that China, and to a lesser extent India, are now engaged in carrying out. Getting America's act together will require repairing and reversing the damage to our human and physical infrastructure that decades of neglect and disinvestment have wrought. Diverting more capital to the U.S. military-industrial complex, as virtually all of our politicians demand, will not offset that damage so much as compound it. The ultimate foundation of America's global influence is not our ability to bomb or assassinate foreigners. It is our capacity to enrich them and ourselves through trade and investment. It is our potential to inspire them by our example to want to emulate and cooperate with us, not shun or injure us. We are strongest abroad when we are most just and prosperous at home. Since 1875 or so, the United States has had the largest economy on the planet. We're about to lose that status. How much power to shape world events we retain will depend on how well we reinvigorate our economy and our society by drawing on the astonishing natural and human resources, the bounty that our geography and history have bestowed on us. It will depend also on the extent to which we exemplify the values we have long professed. Adding to our already enormous military capabilities at the expense of other priorities will not help us rebuild our ebbing influence. Almost 40% of the U.S. industrial base now depends in whole or in part on funding from the Defense Department and related military spending in other parts of the federal budget. As you all know, the defense budget is about 60% of what we actually do in the military sphere. There are military-related measures hidden like Easter eggs all over the federal budget. High levels of government spending on defense and the dollar's status as the global currency, as well as our own, have masked the hollowing out of the U.S. economy by deindustrialization and outsourcing. The Fed has printed all the money Americans have needed to sustain high consumption despite a low savings rate and the inability to set national priorities. The growth of the U.S. financial sector inflates the apparent size and role of the U.S. economy in global terms. Financial operations, not counting insurance, now account for over 9% of U.S. GDP, up from about 3% a few decades ago. Financial engineering, as opposed to the real kind, is where the rake-offs are. So it's where the best, brightest, and greediest young Americans now want to go. You know who you are. The IMF estimates that such parasitic over-financialization now siphons off 2% of annual growth in GDP in the United States. In terms of competitiveness and national resilience, this is not reassuring. De-dollarization of the global economy is slowly gathering speed. When the monetary tide goes out, to paraphrase Warren Buffett, Americans are likely to be revealed to have been swimming naked. China's manufacturing output is already 1.5 times America's, which stands as less than 12% of our GDP. This is a more relevant indicator of competitiveness in international terms than the fact that the United States devotes about 20% of our GDP to health care. Ours is a system designed to ensure the profits of pharmaceutical oligopolies and huge insurance companies, rather than to maximize the efficiency with which it delivers medical care. Other advanced capitalist countries spend about half what Americans do on health care, but secure considerably better results. The World Health Organization, WHO, rates health care in the United States as the world's 37th best, just below that of Costa Rica, but ahead of Slovenia. France is number 1, and Myanmar unexpectedly brings up the rear at 190th place. As the health sector quintessentially illustrates, the American economy is increasingly dominated by rent-seeking and rate-setting monopolies, monopsonies, and oligopolies. Their managers are a donor class before whom our politicians shamelessly abase themselves. The legions of lobbyists these private sector bureaucracies employ ensure that U.S. laws, taxes, regulations, and administrative practices protect their profits and make it as hard as possible for new market entrants to challenge them. For the most part, our corporate conglomerates now grow not by creating new businesses, but through mergers and acquisitions. They collectivize retail and services businesses by replacing them with franchises, reducing independent operators to a status like that of contractors or employees with no benefits. The ability of giant corporate bureaucracies to produce and procure goods and services anywhere in the world enables them to crush competition from small and medium-sized domestic businesses. Their size enables them to dictate the price of most of the goods and services they purchase and remarket. With profits essentially assured, they have no greater incentive than public utilities to invest in productivity or improved services. And so, for the most part, they don't. Stock buybacks, rather than investment, have become the norm for large corporations, which are sitting on a mountain of cash and doing nothing with it. Like U.S. government spending on research and development, corporate spending on it is falling. As a result, the United States is gradually yielding leadership in global innovation to others in a widening range of arenas. We're now number 4 in the number of patents issued, behind South Korea, number 1, Japan, number 2, and China, number 3. Last year, Bloomberg ranked American workers 33rd internationally in technical competence. We are now 19th in the proportion of research personnel to others, and 11th in the percentage of GDP we devote to R&D. We've fallen to 10th place in innovation in manufacturing. Community banks were once a reliable source of capital for new enterprises throughout America. They've been displaced by banks that are both too big to fail and too big to bother with startups and small businesses. Entrepreneurs seeking capital must now look to financial engineers associated with venture capital groups and private equity funds. These masters of the universe lend sparingly while snatching equity for the plutocrats and fund managers whose money they manage. The result is a business culture which, rather than seeking to grow the businesses they have created, entrepreneurs now seek an early profitable exit from them. Not surprisingly, small and medium-sized businesses are no longer creating desirable jobs in the United States at the rate that they once did. Meanwhile, the concentration of capital and business activity in the hands of corporate oligopolies ensures that all malls look alike, with a big box store or two, lots of nationally franchised shops and restaurants, and only a few locally owned independent businesses. A parallel process is at work online. Merchants who sell on the internet are increasingly subsumed in the marketing systems of comprehensive online vendors like Amazon.com. This is an economic structure that invites corporate behemoths to collect rents and set rates at will, with little, if any, countervailing pressure from their employees, shareholders, or consumers. Management-level corporate bureaucrats are free to maximize their own compensation while minimizing pay and benefits for lower-level hires. As a result, real incomes have flatlined in the United States for ordinary Americans. But the United States now has the highest ratio of CEO to employee compensation in the world, and indeed in history. All this means that in today's America, for the most part, those who have lots of money can be confident they'll get more. Those who don't have money won't. This is a devastating reproach to the promise of equality of opportunity that was for so long the hallmark of America. A tax structure that allocates funds for education in proportion to local property values rather than need ensures that those whose parents are poor are not taught the skills they must have to escape poverty. Fractured government at the local level creates redundant and overlapping jurisdictions that overregulate economic activity. Ever more elaborate and comprehensive local licensing procedures, building codes, zones, zoning, work rules set by guilds like teachers' unions, and environmental safeguards protect vested interests by impeding innovation and the adoption of more efficient ways of delivering basic goods and services to the public. How much agility and resilience these structural changes in the American socioeconomic system and instances of regulatory sclerosis have cost the U.S. economy is something only time will tell. But there can be no doubt that the United States is now performing well below our potential. Yet Americans continue smugly to assume that we remain at the forefront of science, technology, and industry, and have little, if anything, to learn from foreigners. This complacency, the economic rise of other great powers, and the entrenchment of dysfunctional government in Washington are major reasons for the ebb in U.S. global competitiveness and prestige. As an American brought up to believe that my country was or should be number one in all things, it is a shock to discover that the United States is now 17th international in per capita GDP, 17th in productivity growth, and 17th in the speed with which a sick person can expect to gain treatment for his or her illness. Americans are 10th on the Human Development Index, which measures the overall quality of life in a given society, and 40th in life expectancy, just below Cubans. It is no consolation to learn that we have become number one, both in our obesity rate, I contribute to that, by the way, and the number of our prisoners per capita. With roughly 1/4 the population, the United States has a prison population 1/3 larger than China's. Nor do the educational attainments of the next American generation, present company exception, inspire confidence. Young Americans are dead last among OECD member nations in numeracy and at their mediocre median in scientific knowledge and literacy. It would appear that notwithstanding our propensity for gazing admiringly at the many elements of our imagined superiority to others, we Americans have an urgent need to get our domestic act together. Part of this surely involves learning from best foreign practices. A little humility would go a long way. A country that can no longer conduct a civil dialogue, agree about domestic priorities or adjust revenue and spending to achieve them, ratify a treaty, or develop coherent foreign policy objectives and strategies to attain them, really has no business pretending it is entitled to lead internationally, as we do. Repairing the causes of our domestic political and economic distress is necessary to reaffirm our purposes as a nation, to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, as the Constitution's preamble proclaims. Returning to the pursuit of these benefits for ourselves, rather than attempting to confer them on others whether they want to have them or not, would go a long way toward fixing what's wrong with us, as well as reestablishing American international prestige and influence. There is absolutely nothing wrong with America that American decisions to face up to our problems and adopt better policies cannot fix. Despite all our afflictions, the United States clearly has what it takes to get our groove back. We are very large, richly endowed by nature, remarkably diverse in our ethnic origins and talent, and possessed of a healthy amount of greed and entrepreneurial drive, even if we're not notably wise or agile at present. We continue to enjoy the superb defensive advantages of a uniquely favorable geopolitical position. As Bismarck observed, quote, "The Americans are truly a lucky people. They're bordered to the north and south by weak neighbors, and to the east and west by fish." Sadly, the fish are mostly gone, but the neighbors are still meek. The United States has a greater margin for error than any conceivable ally or rival. Our endowment and heritage ensure that America is and is likely to remain primus inter pares in international politics. What hand we play in world affairs depends on the extent to which we cure partisan dysfunction and restore civil discourse in Washington. We must address neglected domestic agendas like the need for investment in education and physical infrastructure. We must reform our banking system, tax code, and regulatory structure to promote entrepreneurship, innovation, and social mobility, rather than to protect vested interests. We must bring our nation's foreign policy objectives and commitments into balances with the resources we are prepared to devote to them. And we must focus on correcting the defects in our own society and its performance, rather than imposing our ideas on other societies. The United States played a central part in crafting the modern world. To play a comparable role in shaping the world of the future to our advantage, Americans must regain an accurate perception of ourselves. We must learn from the ways in which others now often outperform us. Knowing ourselves and those with whom we are competing is the key to once again breaking out of the pack. There is an obvious role for universities in restoring such awareness. To identify what needs to be done is easy. To do it is not. Yet our current problems were mostly made in the USA. They must be fixed here. The question is not whether that can be done. It can be. The question is whether Americans will muster the vision, courage, and determination to do it. That's entirely up to us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Freeman. We have a few moments.
Very few.
A little bit of time. If people want to ask questions, please go to the microphone. Hold the line up at the microphone.
First, I'd like to thank you as a longtime resistor to the empire. To hear your analysis actually says, you know, us hippies from the 60s have been right about just about all of it. So I thank you for that. I have a few qualms with it around economics and the environment. I'm not going to waste people's time today, but I'd like to ask if I could get an opportunity at some future point in, you know, the next few weeks to sit down and talk with you about that. So, because I think that a lot of what you have is useful, and, you know, some of it I might like to take up to the Rhode Island legislature and let some of them hear it.
Well, I'd be delighted to sit down and talk with you.
Great. I will give you my card at the reception.
All right, great. Thank you.
I have to say I agree with virtually everything you said.
Must be something wrong with you,
It's hard
Peter.
not to. Well, it was backed up with statistics, and albeit somewhat cherry-picked. I think one thing you overlooked was the quality of American education. If you Google 100 best universities in in the world, there are 30 or 40 that are American.
More than that, I think.
But my question is there anybody in either of the major political parties in this country who come even close to having an agenda that might address the problems which you have so effectively laid out?
Well, you probably own a TV, and I don't own one, so I am unable to answer your question, because you can turn on the TV and judge for yourself whether all of the people out there are addressing these problems or hurling contumely at each other or otherwise playing political games of no consequence. It's not encouraging, I understand. With regard to the university quality, I agree with you, that's very important. However, that is the product of years, decades of investment in those universities, and the availability of those universities as magnets for talent, not just from the United States, but from everywhere. And it is also the product of a society which, until recently, did not interfere with scientific research. But we are becoming more religious, and there are more and more taboos about what can be examined in universities. So while I agree that we have this great advantage, it is, I believe, a wasting asset, and it needs attention if we are to retain the asset.
Hi, three very quick questions. First, can I get a copy of your speech? Second, to what do you attribute the disinvestment in non-military government spending over the past, say, 30, 40 years? And third, where do you find any reason for hope? Because after hearing your speech, I didn't have much walking in. I feel like I'll even less walking out. Thank you.
Well, the speech, I'm sure, will be available through Brown. It will also be on my own personal, quite inadequate website, which is chazfreeman.net. So I'll try to put it up tonight when I go home. As for hope, if we don't do anything, then there is no hope. At least I've been encouraged in this election campaign by the fact that Bernie Sanders is raising some of these questions. But it's pretty clear that he's an outlier in Washington. I think he has excited some attention from younger people. And I'm confident that in due course the United States, which has shown resilience in the past, will regain it. We are a people who have historically embraced change. I think we can recover that again, but it's going to take us a while. And unfortunately, it will probably take some truly dreadful debacle to cause us to reflect. I'm sorry, I've forgotten the second. Why disinvestment? No, I think it's terminal stinginess, and it's what I called fiscal anorexia. We have a fixation with military spending. Nobody ever explains what it's for. It's just an end in itself. It's good, right? Nobody can oppose military spending. It's a jobs program, as I indicated. It's the only form of stimulus that our Congress critters will support in the economy, and therefore it's highly favored. Other functions of government are not. And there's a total disconnect here, which I'm sure the Watson Institute is going to do research on and explain in due course. Why it is that those states in the West that receive more federal money than they pay in are the least favorable toward federal spending. And why it is that the part of the country that pays more to the federal government and gets less benefit, namely this part, is more favorable to federal spending. So it's a mystery to me. I can't explain it. Sir.
Thank you very much for your stunning overview. I think that you've hit on a lot of the important points that, as a young American, I am deeply and gravely concerned about. As someone who wants to learn the skills and also the understanding that would help us fix this problem in the short and near-term future, what do you think are the points of leverage in this large and convoluted system? Right? One of the key things that keeps to come up again is partisan dysfunction, which I think is sort of driven to exist by the existence of an oligopoly class that's very happy with the status quo. Right? In some sense, I think that's also causing the focus in spending, because there's defense companies that are making a lot of money right from the fact that their budget's shaped this way. So what does it take to actually curtail financial influence on what otherwise would be a self-perpetuating and beneficial system?
Complex question. I don't think the defense companies are the perpetrators so much as the beneficiaries of the general impulse to fund vested interests. But we have an unholy combination of requirement for media coverage for political, for election, which means that the average Congress critter has to raise, I think, $30,000 a day in order, if it's an unsafe district. The obvious response to that by members of Congress and state legislators has been to gerrymander so that all districts are safe. It's quite striking. Every 10 years, the Chinese Communist Party undergoes a change in which 85% of the people turn over. We have no such turnover in our government. Once you're elected after the second election, you're probably in for life. So we don't get new blood in, and we have organized our political system precisely to support and protect vested interests. A third reason is, of course, things like Citizens United, which have expanded the pool of cash beyond individual responsibility and allowed enormous expenditures to be made for our politics. So we have politics that, frankly, are venal. There's no other word for them, and that is how they are regarded internationally. We have a system in which we staff our government through the spoils system. We staff our legislature through a system which puts a premium on payoffs. What do you call that? I call it corruption. Do we need to clean this up? Yes. Is it easy? No. We can't have, in our system of government, which requires cooperation across political differences, we cannot have the kind of sharp confrontation, uncompromising confrontation of a parliamentary system. In our system, when you lose an election, that's not it. You're still a participant in the political process. In the parliamentary system, if you lose the election, the other side doesn't have to pay any attention to you at all, and you can make your case as strongly as possible. We need to either go back to the original vision of the Constitution or change it. Yes.
Ambassador, thank you for your comments. I'm interested in your thoughts on the roots of our militarism. The conservative thinker and author Robert Nisbet talked decades ago about the corrosive effects of the constant state of war and how it would erode our political system and individual liberties. And I was also thinking about Martin Luther King Jr.'s acceptance speech in Oslo of the Nobel Peace Prize, where he talked about the fact that he didn't believe civilization and violence could ultimately coexist. So can you comment on the roots of our militarism?
First, let me say, and going back to the first questioner, the Cold War was real. The threat was real. I had my doubts until I had a meeting. I'll just tell you a little story, if you don't mind, and I'll go on to it's relevant, I think. I chaired a series of binational military commissions with the Poles, the Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Czechs, Hungarians, Slovaks, and so on. The first set of these were held in Garmisch in Germany. The first meeting was with the Czech Chief of Staff of the Czech Armed Forces. And we had a very nice, good meeting, and then had dinner. And we spoke. His German was flawless. Mine is lousy. My French is okay. His was okay. So we had a conversation over dinner. And afterwards he said to me, "Would you like to go out and walk on the town?" And I said, "Sure, that's great." And he said, I'll show you around. So we walked out into the town, and he said, "You know, this is Hans Müller's house here, and his wife Heidi has the dress shop over there." And he just sort of went down the street saying what everything was. And I said, "How do you know all these things? How often do you come here?" He said, "This is my first time here, but I trained for the occupation." I'll compress this, but I had similar. The Hungarian spoke perfect Italian. He'd trained for occupying northern Italy. Later, I met with the chief defense guy in Ukraine, who asked him what his major military problems were, since I was at the Defense Department. And he said, "We were trained only for offense. We don't know how to defend." And he told me the greatest moment in his life was when he visited Copenhagen, because he said, "I spent 17 years practicing a paratrooper drop on that place. And to actually be on the ground walking around was a thrill." So it was real. And because it was real, it evoked a military response. George Kennan's containment was originally mostly diplomatic, but it evolved under pressure to become more and more military. And by the time of Eisenhower's departure, he correctly warned of the military-industrial congressional complex as having become a permanent fixture of American life. And then we got into Vietnam, a foolish war, and a war that ended eventually because a conscription army fell apart in the face of the foolishness. And Richard Nixon decided the answer was to build a professional army, the first one we'd had in our history. And we have a professional standing military force, which is superb. I have enormous respect for people in that profession and in our armed forces. But they are detached from the public. And we can now conduct wars with no sacrifice. So George W. Bush, when he gratuitously invaded Iraq for no reason that he can explain, or anybody else can understand, when asked what the American people should do, said, "Go shopping." Now that is not, when you can go to war and murder large numbers of people abroad with no consequence whatsoever for the ordinary citizen, you are in danger of doing what we have done, which is deciding that foreign affairs, what happens abroad, is some sort of sporting event that's shown on ESPN, and it's cost-free and entertaining. And so we don't report body counts except our own. And they're very small because we have superb military training and weaponry. However, others are catching up, so this won't go on forever. I would say the final point is that the establishment of a permanent professional military has enabled the rebirth of military traditions in families, particularly from the South. Some ways, I think the South actually won the Civil War. The Army is very, very Southern in its orientation. Yes. This should be the last.
Hello, Mr. Freeman. I just wanted to ask you a question that you briefly touched on, which is China and its relations with its Asian neighbors. And given what I've read about what other Asian countries think of China, they seem to be very scared of China, and understandably so. And I guess you talked about cooperating with China, but at the same time, how can we deal with China's own ambitions and its own designs for hegemony in the region?
Well, that's a great question. I'm actually going to talk about that next Thursday a bit. But I would just say that the question, there's a more fundamental anterior question. What is it that we're defending? Are we defending our hegemony on China's doorstep? Are we defending our dominance of the Pacific? Or are we defending our homeland against a threat? Because it's very hard to identify a threat from China to our homeland. It's very easy to demonstrate that if current trends continue, we will be squeezed out of the overall dominating role we've had in Western Pacific since we defeated the Japanese Imperial Navy, which had, with the Japanese Imperial Army, previously defeated European colonialism. So what are we there for? Now, China's neighbors, of course, are apprehensive, as we are, because, as I said, we've been number one economically since 1875 or 1880. We're now not going to have that position. That's psychologically trying. Japan has already gone through this experience of having been number one in Asia and being displaced. It's not a pleasant experience, apparently. And there are differences between China and its neighbors over territory, mostly insignificant territory, which, basically so insignificant that everybody's had to go out of their way to build things on top of it to make it possible to be there. The Vietnamese pioneered that, the Philippines, and now the Chinese have done it in typically grand Chinese style. But I'd say that the main challenge from China is economic and scientific and technological, and it needs to be met on those terms rather than military. And if you doubt that, just consider this. By 2025, if current trends continue, the STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics workforce in China alone will be larger than that in all of the OECD. We want to see where innovation is likely to migrate to. That's there. So that should stimulate us, again, to try harder. But I don't hear anybody discussing that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chaz. Because I've known you for a number of years, I'm no longer surprised by your ability to speak so comprehensively across great geographies and periods of time. I must say, though, as always, I feel probably, and I could speak for everybody this way, there's some things that you said that for which we agree and absolutely make sense. It's the things that sometimes you say that we haven't thought of or that I don't agree with that just dazzle me, force me to think about problems I thought I understood well, think about them in a new light. And that is the gift of an educator. And just last but not least, I'll say, more so than usual, you left me feeling bereft. I have to say, very tough talk. But as I look at the title of your next two talks, the next talk next Thursday will be The United States and the New World Disorder. Maybe not overly optimistic either. But the last talk, 2 weeks from now, Recovering Diplomatic Agility, suggests that there may be a glimmer of hope at the end. So let me thank you for this talk and invite you all to join us for the next two sessions, subsequent Thursdays.